Today is August 4th, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine continues to grind on. The collective West continues to gradually, incrementally admit just how poorly what is essentially a US proxy war against Russia taking place in Ukraine, how poorly this conflict is now going. And I will get into additional admissions from across the Western media regarding just how bad this conflict is. But first, let's take a look at the situation on the ground. In the beginning of August 2024, this is via liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map. This is a map that will delay reporting Russian gains for days, sometimes even weeks, very reluctantly admitting Russian successes. But even this pro-Ukrainian map paints a very bleak picture for Ukraine itself. So let's take a look at it. In red is territory held by Russia. The line of contact stretches from Kherson here in the south, through Zaporozhye, the Donbas region, and of course there is this front in Kharkov, north of Kharkov city. And if we look along the line of contact, we're going to notice that Russian forces are, as has been the case for weeks now, making much more significant gains. They have been making incremental gains all along, but the gains are increasing in speed. And this is because, as a war of attrition, as Russia builds up its military power and as it grinds down Ukrainian military power, this process is going to take place at a faster and faster pace. The more Russia builds itself up and the more it grinds Ukraine down, the faster this whole process will go. So just outside Donetsk city and at Avdiivka, which in the beginning of this year, January 2024, this was the front line. Russian forces have pushed this much further out, and they have a timeline here. So you can see August, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. If we go back to, say, the beginning of July, between the beginning of July and the beginning of August, this is how far Russian forces have advanced. So this was July 1st, and now in the beginning of August, this is how much further Russian forces have advanced. And we'll see a similar picture all along the line of contact. We see Russian forces had been outside Chasiv Yar in July. Now they are inside this built up area and are also encircling it. And of course, even here in Volchansk, where we are told by Ukrainian and Western media that this front line has been stabilized, we see Russian forces have actually, according to the pro-Ukrainian map, they have advanced. Even if ever so slightly. This pro-Ukrainian map is showing these Russian advances. Now we have a number of Western headlines talking about these advances. Via CNN, this was right at the end of July 30th, 2024, Russia creeps toward key eastern Ukrainian supply city. And the article says Russian forces are inching toward the strategically important city of Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine, threatening a vital Ukrainian supply line as Moscow continues its slow, grinding offensive. Russia has been stretching Ukrainian defenses across the entire eastern front line for months, trying to capture as much territory as possible. And this part I'm going to talk about in more details. This myth that Russia is trying to capture as much territory as possible before new Ukrainian recruits and fresh batches of Western weapons start arriving on the battlefield. This is not coming. Ukraine cannot mobilize men faster than they are losing them on the battlefield. The collective West cannot manufacture arms and ammunition faster than it's being spent or lost on the battlefield. This is a fact that even the Western media over months now has been gradually admitting publicly. The gains made by Russia have been largely incremental. The front line has barely moved in the past few months. I just showed you how just between the beginning of July and now the beginning of August, how much it has changed. But the recent advance toward Pokrovsk has Ukraine and its allies worried. And the whole point is the Western media, Western politicians, of course, the Ukrainian government's military analysts, commentators, they all believe that the only type of military success there could possibly be is rapid territorial gains, like the US achieved in, say, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But in reality, if you are waging a war where both sides are in possession of large numbers of trained troops and large amounts of modern equipment, you're not going to be making vast territorial gains like the US did in Iraq. That was because it was such a vast mismatch. That is why the US was able to take territory so quickly. If the US was trying to storm its way into Ukraine, it would be in the exact same position Russia is. Actually, it'd be in a much worse position because the US doesn't have this sort of artillery, armor, drones, long-range precision-guided weapons in the quantities Russia has available to it. So it would actually be in a much worse position. It's important to understand this when reading these articles, trying to spin the reality of what is happening on the battlefield. This is a war of attrition. This is not maneuver warfare. This is not Russia trying and failing to seize huge tracts of territory. This is Russia deliberately choosing a strategy of attrition to grind Ukrainian forces down and eventually precipitate a collapse. Then they could take as much territory as they want. Now, new Ukrainian recruits are being pressed into service. They're given insufficient training. They will arrive at the line of contact, poorly trained, poorly motivated. Many of them do not want to fight. And of course, they will be poorly equipped and armed. This is a reality. So speeding these conscripts to the front line is not going to make the difference the Western media is trying to claim that it will. As a matter of fact, sending poorly trained troops to the front line is only going to accelerate this process of Ukrainian forces being grinded down. The faster Russia grinds them down, the faster Ukraine needs to find recruits, conscripts, push them toward the line of contact. The less prepared they will be, the faster they will perish, the more conscripts Ukraine is going to have to press into service, speed through their training, and send to the line of contact. It is a vicious cycle that at this point cannot be broken. And again, this concept of fresh batches of Western weapons being on their way, somehow they're on their way, they're not on their way. We've talked about this many times, especially over the last several months. The collective West admits that their military-industrial output is insufficient to sustain a war on this scale, at this level of intensity, for this protracted period of time. Now, I'm actually going to go over the latest US military assistance package to Ukraine, which was announced on July 29th, 2024. But just to give you a quick preview, it is almost entirely the same items that were announced in the previous several packages, because at this point, US stockpiles have been exhausted of whatever can be spared to send Ukraine. And now the US is drawing almost entirely from monthly production, which is not significant. And so a percentage of a very small monthly production is being skimmed off and sent to Ukraine. It is not nearly enough. It will not be enough. It will never be enough in the near, intermediate, even distant future, because there aren't even plans to significantly expand production, even approaching levels that Ukraine requires. Now, CNN also says, Pokrovsk is not a major city. About 60,000 people lived there before the war, and many have left since the start of the full-scale invasion. But it serves as a key hub for Ukrainian military, thanks to its easy access to Konstantinivka, another military center. The road connecting the two is used by the Ukrainians to resupply troops on the front lines and evacuate casualties toward the Dnipro. So we're always hearing from the Western media about these cities are strategically insignificant, Russian gains are slow, they're incremental. But if you add all of this up over time, you can see very clearly how this This is not about seizing huge tracts of territory. This is a war of attrition, and it is unfolding decisively in favor of Russia. Now, this is how the CNN article ends. Ukraine finally started to receive new batches of US weapons in May. So all the way back in May, these weapons have arrived. The situation has only gotten worse along the line of contact. I wonder if they're going to explain how that adds up. Following months of delays, and it has recruited thousands of new soldiers that are currently in training and are expected to start arriving at the front lines in the fall. It takes, at a minimum, 6 months to train an effective infantryman. These conscripts aren't going to get even half of that. The combination of the two should give Ukraine much needed boost, and Russia's strategy appears to be to slow this down as much as possible by pushing ahead and making these gradual, seemingly incremental advances along the more than 600-mile-long, 1,000-kilometer-long front line. Russia is forcing Ukraine to commit to defensive operations rather than gear up for a counteroffensive. And what they're describing is actually the same process Russia committed to ahead of the 2023 Ukrainian offensive, where at that time, Ukraine had many times more trained soldiers at their disposal. They were standing up new brigades. The collective West was pouring everything that was in their stockpiles at the time that they could spare into Ukraine. That cannot be done again. That cannot be done again on the scale that it was done in 2023. And if we remember, the 2023 Ukrainian offensive was decisively defeated by Russian forces. It didn't even come close to achieving any of its objectives. And the prospect of Ukraine even mounting a failed offensive on that scale is next to impossible, let alone mounting a successful offensive. So that was at the end of July. And here's a bit of a more recent article, August 3rd. Ukraine war briefing. Waves of Russian bombings and infantry assaults drive major gains in East. Russian military intensifies pressure on key Ukrainian transport hub of Pokrovsk. Kiev receives bodies of 250 slain soldiers in exchange with Moscow. So this is their update on day 892 of this conflict, the beginning of Russia's special military operation, which began in February 2022. So this is what The Guardian says, much of the same as what CNN reported a few days previously. Russian assaults are raising pressure on the strategic eastern logistics hub of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region, Ukraine says, as waves of guided bombs and infantry led to some of Moscow's largest territorial gains since the spring. The push is fueling a surge in civilians fleeing, with requests for evacuation in the area increasing about tenfold over the past 2 weeks, according to a volunteer helping people leave. Russia's gains of about 57 square kilometers in the space of a week are the third largest recorded since April, after they made only modest gains in June. Again, this obsession with territorial gains, when in reality, Russia's goal is to simply grind Ukraine's forces down. They take territory when it is possible. They're not trying to take territory and in the process destroying Ukrainian forces. It is the other way around. Russian forces are using warplanes and artillery fire to support waves of infantry assaults in the area near Pokrovsk, a spokesperson for Ukraine's National Guard said in televised remarks. These assaults are not always supported by armored vehicles. Often it is infantry assaults. Is this some sort of attempt to claim Russia is out of armored vehicles because Russia is not out of armored vehicles? Often what we see along the line of contact is a reflection of the state of modern warfare, the presence of large numbers of drones on both sides, kamikaze drones. If you're mounting an armored assault, it is impossible to do it. With the battlefield constantly surveilled, you cannot move large armored vehicles in large numbers across the battlefield without being detected. If you are detected, waves of first-person view kamikaze drones are going to be sent and your armored vehicles are going to be destroyed. If you send infantry, either using very fast means of transportation or they try to infiltrate their way toward the line of contact using cover, this is much better for both sides. We see both sides using this strategy now. The advantage Russia has, according to The Guardian itself, is large numbers of glide bombs and also artillery, which we know Ukraine is either doesn't have at all or is very short on. Ukraine has glide bombs, but almost a negligible number, because they have a negligible number of warplanes at their disposal, and their artillery, both guns and ammunition, has been flagging for months, if not over a year, well over a year. It's a significant threat because of Provolsk and Toretsk fronts are taking a large share of the daily aviation strikes carried out on the positions of Ukrainian defenders. Russian forces have been steadily inching forward on several fronts in the eastern Donetsk region, staging particularly fierce attacks near Pokrovsk, with Kiev's troops stretched thin. Again, this is the whole point of all of this. And again, we continuously heard Ukraine say they stabilized the front in Kharkov. Well, at the cost of stretching your forces thinner all throughout the Donbas region, allowing Russia to accelerate the process of destroying troops there and taking additional territory. So let's get into arms and ammunition. I'm going to go over the Pentagon's latest assistance package. Let's talk a little bit about the F-16s. The F-16s are reportedly on their way. This is from the Guardian Ukraine War Briefing. First F-16 fighter jets arrive. Officials. And we're talking about a handful, a small number of F-16 fighter jets. I've talked about this exhaustively, how ideally you would need probably up to 10 years or at least 5 years, 5 to 10 years to properly prepare for integrating a new warplane into your armed forces. It takes years for a nation to integrate a new type of warplane into their armed forces. Ukraine is trying to do this in just months. Training pilots could take a year or more. They're getting trained in just over the course of a couple of months. They are going to have a small number of F-16s. The F-16 itself does not have any sort of capability that Ukraine's original Air Force didn't have. And so what you have is a similar case to what happened with Ukraine's original supply of, say, Soviet-era artillery, air defenses, and armor being replaced by Western equipment. Western equipment that in some cases was of similar capability or even less capable. Also a huge deficit in training. Ukrainian forces simply unable to use these Western weapons as effectively as their Soviet-era weapon systems that they had years and years of experience on. And also the fact that the Western equipment is being supplied to Ukraine in entirely insufficient numbers. And there's no way to send large quantities of F-16s to Ukraine and have them piloted and maintained by Ukrainians. You could send large numbers of F-16s to Ukraine if they're going to be piloted by existing NATO pilots and serviced by existing NATO maintenance crews. But you could not do it if all of this was to be done by Ukrainians. And even if they were piloted and maintained by NATO personnel, even if they were posing as Ukrainians, it still doesn't matter because the F-16 is incapable of overcoming Russian air defenses. Just as Russian air power is inhibited by what's left of Ukraine's Soviet-era air defenses and also the small number of Western air defense systems, Russian military aviation still has limits on what it can do because of the existence of modern air defense systems on the battlefield. The F-16s are going to face the exact same problem. So we have this from The Guardian. Ukraine has received the first F-16 fighter jets, a U.S. official has confirmed to AP. The arrival of the jets was first reported by Bloomberg. A Ukrainian lawmaker also confirmed Ukraine has received a small number of F-16 jets. And two officials spoke to AP on a condition of anonymity because they were not permitted to discuss the subject publicly. We also have from the Wall Street Journal, U.S. to arm Ukraine's F-16 jets with advanced weapons. Well, of course, they're U.S.-made warplanes, so they require U.S.-made ordnance. US has agreed to arm dozens of F-16 fighter jets being sent to Ukraine with American-made missiles and other advanced weapons, addressing a long-standing question about the Western aircraft. I don't know why that would have been a question there. US-made warplanes that use US-made ordnance, so obviously the US needs to provide the ordnance. Now, what we have heard about the F-16s is that for the time being, primarily, they're going to be used in an air defense role. When Ukraine expects cruise missile strikes from Russia, they will mobilize, they will scramble their F-16s, they will take to the air, and they will try to lock on, target, and destroy incoming cruise missiles and drones. The problem is Russia has so many missiles and so many drones. As I have reported many times before, citing the Western media, Russia is firing over 4,000 missiles, just 4,000 missiles, not even talking about the thousands of drones launched into Ukraine at targets all across the country. 4,000 missiles alone, a handful of F-16s, even the ground-based air defense systems the collective West has been sending to Ukraine are incapable of intercepting this many incoming missiles. The collective West does not manufacture enough air defense munitions to intercept this many incoming targets. It is a cold, hard fact. Scrambling F-16s into the air and having them intercept cruise missiles is one of the least efficient ways of defending your airspace. So this is an act of desperation. This has public relations implications. It could maybe boost morale simply because the public doesn't understand how meaningless these F-16s are in terms of changing anything about the strategic course of this fight. You also have to remember that the air-to-air munitions that could possibly be given to Ukraine to use against Russian forces are going to be drawn from monthly production and stockpiles the US and Europe are trying to save for potential conflict with, say, China in the Asia-Pacific region. So the US has really painted itself into a corner with this proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, trying to stretch it out for as long as possible. They're now dipping into stockpiles, weapons, ammunition that they need for the other, much larger conflict they're planning against China. And that they might also need for a conflict that they are also engineering in or cultivating, perpetuating in the Middle East. So that is F-16s. Let's get into this right here. From the US Department of Defense, Biden administration announces additional security assistance for Ukraine, July 28th, 2024. Here's the list. Not a single quantity provided, because as I said in the beginning, they provided quantities because they were large numbers. And so it helped boost public perception that Ukraine was receiving overwhelming support from the West. And it was also supposed to sow doubt in the minds of Russians that the US was in it for as long as it takes, and they had what it took to continue supporting Ukraine. The quantities have disappeared because if they listed the quantities, you would see just how desperate the situation has become for Western military industrial production, their inability to sufficiently supply Ukraine. So let's go over some of these items that are on the list here. The first on the list is munitions for National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, or NASM. So this is a system alongside the Patriot missile system. These are supposed to be somewhat longer range air defense systems. NASMs is supposedly using a air-to-air missile that should exist in much larger quantities than Patriot interceptors, but apparently there is a shortage of these missiles, so much so that we remember this article from June 2024. US will boost Ukraine's air defense by pausing exports to allies. So they were going to pause exports of Patriot interceptors, also NASM interceptors, to certain allies, so they could take that monthly production and send it straight to Ukraine because of the critical shortages. No matter how many missiles the US has available for NASMs, it's not going to be enough to intercept the 4,000 plus missiles that Russia is launching at targets across Ukraine every single year. For the Patriot missile system, it's even worse because, as I have said many times, the US only produces between 500 550 Patriot missile interceptors every single year. They're talking about expanding production to perhaps 600 to 650. Again, 650, even if they were to reach 650 today, that would not be enough to intercept the 4,000 plus missiles Russia is launching at targets across Ukraine every single year. Next on the list is short and medium range air defense munitions. So they don't give any specific information as to what systems these are, but it could refer to systems like the Stinger. The Stinger is a man-portable air defense system, manpads. It could also be mounted on as part of the Avenger system. This is a vehicle-mounted short-range air defense system. We remember thousands of Stingers were sent to Ukraine in the beginning of the conflict. The stockpiles were exhausted, and now the US depends on monthly production. What is monthly production according to Janes? They're planning on doubling Stinger production to 60 a month by 2025, which means current production is around 30 missiles a month. Ukraine has more air defense units than the US can provide missiles to Ukraine per month. And that's if every single missile produced goes straight to Ukraine, which is almost certainly not the case. Next on the list, RIM-7 missiles for air defense. RIM-7 missiles are actually naval air defense missiles, but they are being adapted to work with what remains of Ukraine's Soviet-era air defense system. So here's an article from the War Zone. Ukraine's Frankensam that uses RIM-7 Sea Sparrow missiles breaks cover. And so it's basically a Buk, a Soviet-era Buk air defense system. They're out of the Soviet-era missiles, so they are using RIM-7 missiles instead. And this article says, first official photos have appeared showing Soviet-era ground-based air defense system upgraded with Western surface-to-air missiles. A so-called Frankensam, the images published by Ukraine's Operational Command East show a tracked self-propelled Buk M1 system, known in the West as SA-11 Gadfly, which is said to have been adapted to fire this RIM-7 Sea Sparrow missile that previously provided point defense for numerous NATO and allied warships. The same article talks about how these type of air defense systems are used to shoot down Russian surveillance drones. The problem is, again, Russia is making so many surveillance drones. There are so many up in the air. The missiles, the systems themselves are so few in number, they can't possibly down all of these surveillance drones. We've seen footage of high-value Ukrainian military targets being watched by Russian surveillance drones guiding in Iskander ballistic missiles because Ukraine did not have air defenses available or capable of shooting down the surveillance drone. This is a huge and growing problem. It's only going to get worse because whatever means the US comes up with to find a way to supply weapons to Ukraine, the entire military industrial capacity of the West is incapable of providing sufficient numbers of any of the solutions they find to these problems, for these problems. Next on the list, electronic warfare equipment. They give no information about that at all. We've seen Western media, the Western media admit that Russia dominates the battlefield with electronic warfare capabilities. The West is trying to provide Ukraine with, I guess, somewhat similar capabilities. The problem is Russia, and before Russia, the Soviet Union, invested decades and decades of time, energy, resources, and research and development for electronic warfare capabilities. You cannot just overnight replicate these type of capabilities, match or exceed these capabilities on the battlefield. There's a lot of catching up the collective West needs to do. And again, because of the way their military industrial base is set up, driven primarily by profit, the process is going to be even slower than if it was a purpose-driven defense industry. Ammunition for high mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS. Well, this could be the guided rockets with about a 70-kilometer range, or it could be ATACMS with a 300-kilometer range. What it probably isn't are small diameter, ground-launched small diameter bombs, because as the Western media has reported, again, Russian electronic warfare jams their GPS guidance, and these are next to useless on the battlefield. They were ground-launched, small-diameter bombs. They were launched by HIMARS or the M270 multiple launch rocket system. They have a longer range than the 70-kilometer guided rocket, but Russia is able to sufficiently defend against them to the point where they're essentially useless. 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds, again, with the artillery ammunition, the whole reason 105 millimeter rounds are being sent there. They have a smaller diameter, they have a shorter range. They're being sent because the US and Europe doesn't have enough 155 millimeter artillery rounds, and they never will. All of the expansion programs for 155 rounds, their targets for production expansion are admittedly falling far short. Europe producing a third of what they had claimed they were producing, and even the US facing production problems, inhibiting the expansion, the sufficient expansion of artillery shell production. So they will expand the number of shells that they're making, just not fast enough. In 2 or 3 years, the US and Europe combined will still be making fewer rounds than Russia is making now. In 2 or 3 years, Russia will only be making more rounds than they already are now. There's 120 millimeter mortar rounds, precision aerial munitions. These could be JDAM or air-dropped small diameter bombs. It's originally an air-dropped munition that had been adapted to being fired from ground-launched multiple launch rocket systems. There's also tube-launched optical tracked wire-guided missiles, TOW missiles, and also Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor systems. Again, they sent thousands of these in the beginning. Now they are drawing from monthly production. Between the small quantity that the US produces month to month and the fact that even well-trained US soldiers have a 19% hit rate with these anti-armor systems, the US is literally not able to send enough missiles to Ukraine to destroy Russian armor faster than Russia can make it month to month. Next, small arms. So this is an item they used to include quantities for, and it would include millions of rounds of small arms ammunition. We're talking about for assault rifles, for 5.56 millimeter rounds, NATO standard, also 7.62, which is the Soviet standard. And this was an area that I had given benefit of the doubt and believed that the West probably could supply Ukraine with an ample amount of, but apparently they cannot, or somewhere in the loop, ammunition is being sold off because of corruption. For some reason, not enough even small arms and ammunition are reaching the front. We have this article from the Washington Post that I've already gone over before. This was from June 2nd, 2024. Basic training in Ukraine is barely covering the basics, commanders say. In this article, they're talking about how there's only 20 rounds. A conscript is only given 20 rounds to practice with before they're sent off to the front line. So where is all the ammunition disappearing off to? Apparently, the collective West is incapable of providing Ukraine with enough ammunition, because enough ammunition means enough for the line of contact, also enough for training. It appears that they don't have enough for either. And finally, the list, it ends with explosive, material and demolitions equipment and munitions, spare parts, maintenance and sustainment support and other equipment, secure communication systems. These are things all military forces have. None of it is game-changing. Russia almost certainly has similar capabilities, most likely in larger quantities than Ukraine is receiving. One interesting item, though, that I don't think that I have seen before is commercial satellite imagery services. Now, we know that the United States provides Ukraine with military satellite images, coordinates, intelligence. We know this since they sent HIMARS and other long-range precision-guided weapons. The US, the UK, we remember the German officers being caught talking about this. They provide Ukraine with military-level intelligence. Now they're also listing commercial satellite imagery services. I can't imagine why they would need that when they have access to the much better and more specific military satellite imagery services. But it's on the list nonetheless. We read in the articles that Ukraine is going to be receiving additional Western weapons and ammunition. It's going to arrive, is going to change the tide of the fighting. But as we can see from the assistance package itself, it cannot. There's no possible way for it. The quantities and the quality of the weapons and ammunition sent to Ukraine has been steadily declining all along over the course of the last 2+ years. And this is something that cannot be fixed because the military industrial base across the collective West cannot be fixed. It itself cannot be fixed, so this problem cannot be fixed. And I've gone over in detail why that is. And because of it, we are starting to see a very precarious geopolitical situation emerge for the United States and for the Ukrainian proxies. So we have this article here from Reuters. Ukraine's Zelensky wants China to put more pressure on Russia. And so we remember that China invited Ukrainian representatives to China to talk about a possible resolution for this conflict. This is what the Reuters article says. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Kiev does not want China to act as a mediator in the 29-month-old conflict with Russia, but hoped Beijing would apply greater pressure on Moscow to end the war. So this is a complete disconnect from reality. Ukraine is completely losing in this proxy war. The longer this proxy war continues, the more Ukraine is going to lose. If you look at every step of the way, from 2014, when the US overthrew the elected government of Ukraine, to the Minsk agreements, to the initial launch of the special military operation, to where we are right now, you can see Ukraine's position getting decisively weaker at each and every step, and irreversibly weaker. And so the longer they drag this out, the longer they avoid facing reality and they drag this out, the more they're going to lose, and they will never get it back. And now they're saying, we don't want China to mediate. We just want them to force Russia to basically surrender to us, despite the facts on the ground demonstrating we are decisively losing this proxy war. The article also says, if China wants to, it can force Russia to stop this war. I do not want China to act as a mediator. I would like them to put pressure on Russia to put an end to this war, Zelensky told reporters. Just as the United States is applying pressure, just as the European Union is applying pressure, the more influence a country has, the greater should be its pressure on Russia. Again, completely delusional, and not just detached from the reality on the ground in Ukraine, detached from the reality of geopolitics in general. The United States is fighting a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine to encircle and contain Russia, but that is just part of its overall global geopolitical agenda. Additionally, it is seeking to encircle and contain China, and China realizes this, and they realize their fate is connected directly to the fate of Russia. Russia and China also understand that the exact same process is unfolding in the Middle East. Just as Ukraine is being used as a proxy against Russia, just as Taiwan is being used as a proxy against the rest of China, just as I have explained, the Philippines is being transformed into a Ukraine-style proxy against China, Israel is being used as a proxy against America's many adversaries in the region. Hezbollah, southern Lebanon, the current government in Syria, many elements of the government and military in Iraq, Yemen, and also obviously Iran. So there's this much larger conflict taking place. China is well aware of this. They understand that if the US is successful in Ukraine, it's only going to make it that much easier for the US to then consolidate and focus on encircling and containing China itself. So China is never, ever going to go for this. For Ukraine to talk about this demonstrates a complete disconnect from reality. We also have this from Voice of America. This is US government-funded media. Ukraine invites Chinese foreign minister to visit. So again, in complete bad faith. They're going to invite China to visit Ukraine so that they can put pressure on them to end the conflict. It is a diplomatic trap for China. If China were to go to Ukraine, I almost guarantee that both Ukraine, the Western media would try to spin that as some sort of divide growing between China and Russia. I don't think China is going to fall for it. Even if they were to send someone to Kiev, I don't think anyone in China or anyone in Russia would fall for this. And here is an interesting article that I just came across. We saw the very large, complicated prisoner swap between the United States and Russia. This was done through mediators, including Turkey. To have this Washington Post article, Ukraine watches warily as prisoner swap proves Moscow and West can negotiate. And what they're talking about basically is Ukrainian fears that if they're negotiating to swap prisoners, maybe the US is negotiating with Russia to end the proxy war in Ukraine. Now again, the US is not going to end the proxy war in Ukraine because it desires peace. It's going to abandon its proxy war in Ukraine because it has run its course, and the US needs to now focus on the larger, more dangerous conflict it is trying to provoke with China. That's the only reason they will abandon Ukraine, is to double down on a much more dangerous conflict with China. So that's what this article is talking about, the fear that Ukrainian officials now have that they're going to be abandoned. We have Mikhail Podolyak, a Zelensky advisor. He said in an interview that Ukraine is now too independent to be sidestepped during any potential negotiations and to have a ceasefire terms imposed on them by others. But this, again, this is completely delusional. Ukraine is not independent, has zero agency. If the United States decided to end the conflict today, they would cut weapons and support off, and the client regime in Ukraine, in Kiev, would collapse tomorrow. And how do we know this? Because history is replete with examples of this. When the United States pulled the plug on its war in Vietnam, the client regime in South Vietnam collapsed. Same for Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, the US abandoned Afghanistan not because it desired peace in Central Asia, but because they had limited resources. They were preparing for the proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. They needed to redirect all of their resources and attention toward the proxy war in Ukraine. So they pulled out of Afghanistan. The client regime that they had been building up for almost 20 years in Kabul collapsed almost overnight. And so when it is time to abandon Ukraine, to double down on potential war with China, the exact same process is going to take place. Ukraine has no material, economic, or political means to sustain itself if the United States decides to pull the plug on the proxy war there. And so this is where we are with Ukraine. The proxy war is reaching an irreversible point of no return. There's no way to salvage this. The only thing the US can do is try to stretch it out for as long as possible, but there is this necessity to cut their losses and focus entirely on their proxy war with China. What we have to understand is that none of these conflicts the US is involved in around the globe exists in a vacuum. They are all interconnected. The proxy war in Ukraine against Russia is connected directly to US support for Israel against Iran, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, southern Lebanon, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and it's all connected to US attempts to encircle and contain China and Asia Pacific. They are all interconnected. The US ideally would have wanted to control the Middle East, to have reasserted control over the Middle East from 2000 onward during the so-called War on Terror. They wanted to destabilize, undermine, and collapse the Russian Federation. They have failed to do either. All of this was meant to completely isolate China in East Asia. They have failed to do this. So as the window of opportunity to act militarily against China closes, or perhaps has already closed, we can see the United States rushing through, making many mistakes, struggling everywhere, succeeding nowhere. We're at a very dangerous, precarious juncture right now. But people have to understand that this is all part of one overarching geopolitical agenda, transcends presidential administrations, as I've tried to explain many times before. We know for a fact that there are policy papers out there like this from Rand Corporation, 2019, extending Russia, competing from advantageous ground. You can download this for free and read it. This is the cover page. This is the table of contents, and they talk about all of the measures in 2019 that they wanted to apply against Russia, to isolate it, contain it, and precipitate a Soviet-style collapse. They talk about sanctions, hindering petroleum exports, reduce national gas exports, and hinder pipeline expansions. All of these have already been undertaken by the US to one degree or another. Whether they're successful or not is another story, but all of these options have been exercised. Provide lethal aid to Ukraine, and I've gone over it many times. The whole point of that was to draw Russia into a costly, protracted conflict in Ukraine, which they are now involved in. And the idea was to overextend Russia, collapse Russia, but we see that that is not happening. Just as they had a paper in 2019 about using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, we have a 2009 paper, all the way back from 2009, by Brookings Institution, very similar to the RAND Corporation. Which path to Persia? Options for a new American strategy toward Iran. Right here, June 2009. You can download and read this for free online also. This is the cover. This is the table of contents. It's all the exact same options that the US exercised against Russia. These are simply focused on Iran. As a matter of fact, besides the date and the names in these policy papers, they could be identical policy papers. It's the exact same strategy the US uses absolutely everywhere. So if the US is using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia in Eastern Europe, who is the US using as a proxy against Iran in the Middle East? The answer is obviously Israel. And there is an entire chapter in this 2009 paper literally titled, "Leave it to Bibi, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike on Iran." Bibi, for people who don't know, is the nickname of current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was also Prime Minister back when that paper was published. If you read this chapter, all it talks about is how the US can use Israel to provoke a war with Iran, pretend that the US had nothing to do with provoking the war, even though it is their plan, and then to wade into the war in support of Israel and appear reluctant to do so. The whole point is to start a war with Iran and make it look like it wasn't America's plan to do so, that they were dragged into it rather than behind it all along. So that is a black and white, signed and dated policy paper from 2009. Every single point in that paper from that point onward has been exercised and at least attempted or underway since then. And of course, the United States is pursuing the exact same strategy here in Asia Pacific. Again, the island province of Taiwan being used against the rest of China, the Philippines, attempts all across Southeast Asia to overthrow pro-Chinese governments friendly with China, overthrowing them and attempting to install anti-China client regimes in their place, just as the US has done all across Eastern Europe. It is one plan, and they repeat it over and over again all around the globe in every single region. We have to zoom out. We have to avoid being pulled into the minutia of each and every one of these conflicts. And for Israel especially, its conflict with the Palestinians, with Hezbollah and Lebanon, against Iran itself, people get so drawn into this, they're incapable of zooming out and realizing that this is just one conflict among a series of conflicts the US is waging all around the globe, using the exact same strategy, using proxies to manipulate public perception and advance their geopolitical objectives. People need to zoom out and see this. It is our only chance of raising awareness of this overarching agenda, and our only chance, because to understand it, is to be able to formulate a solution to it. I will continue keeping an eye on all of this, not just the conflict in Ukraine. I hope to address the brewing conflict in the Middle East. And as always, I keep a close eye on what is happening in Asia Pacific, which is actually where I am based. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check out the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. This includes Rumble, where I am now uploading all of my videos. All of my videos from YouTube are backed up on Rumble. I also am putting all of my videos on Telegram. All of my videos, all of my articles go up on Telegram. That would be a very good place to follow my work if you don't want to follow my work on YouTube, or if you're worried about any kind of censorship. Some of the articles that I write, the links to those articles are censored by X, the social media platform X, for example. Also in the video description are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you have no additional resources to spare, you're just helping share my work with others, getting the word out there. That is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.